Hello everybody and welcome to Brewmasters, where we interview tabletop game designers to get their insights on the craft. This week we're talking to Sly Flourish, the mastermind behind the Lazy DM series and author of Fantastic Lairs, plus all kinds of ad hoc 5e content like adventures and special locations you can drop into your own games. Before we get to that though, obviously I've been very quiet this past month, and if you aren't following me on Twitter or happen to be in that one Discord I use, then you might be wondering why. Well, I'm now recording in an entirely different apartment. That's right, I moved houses in London, which was a whole thing. And then I've also been dealing with a lot of real life stuff, from doxers to dieting, fixing my PC, and exploring a career change. Needless to say, July has been a hectic month. And while things are quieter now, I still have some things which will unfortunately have to take priority where they can. Long story short, Brewmasters will be updated a little less frequently than normal. Likely once a month for the moment until my life is less crazy. But I'll try to keep you guys updated as best I can, and of course, I appreciate your patience. So with all that covered, I'm going to use my call to action move. I roll with cool, and on a 10+, all listeners like and subscribe to stay up to date with the latest interviews. On a 7 to 9, they only like, and on a miss, I lose subscribers. And that's an 11, baby. And don't forget to hit that bell icon if you want to get notified when a new episode comes out. With all that out of the way, let's get to it. Hey, thank you very much, Mike, for joining us. I really appreciate having you on the show.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Fantastic. Well, let's get straight into it. So, obviously, one of the things I think you're most famous for being the author of the Lazy DM series.
Yeah.
I mean, personally, I love that book. Like, it really revolutionized the way that I approach dungeon mastering. I had no idea that it wasn't just meant to be a script.
Yeah, right. I'm supposed to write a story, right? And I bring a story to the game and they play the story. That's how this is supposed to work.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, it's a huge misconception that I think so many people fall into. And a lot of the DM advice that I've seen, be it like from Satine's show or Matt Colville or your own work, it's always reinforcing the idea that it's a shared experience. And I think what especially struck me about your work is that you present the idea of dungeon mastering as here's like a list of things that you can boil down and incorporate into the game at any point for you to be reactive and spontaneous.
Yeah. The idea of knowing how to prepare to improvise is something that I tried to dive deep in and spend a fair bit of time thinking about and writing about over the years.
And does that come from you, like the way that you DM, or is that from more like thinking about it and analyzing it?
Both, but probably. So my style of DMing has changed a lot over the years and probably will continue to change over the years. And I certainly was a more, I had a story in my head that I wanted to play out a certain way and then got mad when things didn't play the way I expected them to. That's kind of an overgeneralization, but it's not like I had players who hated my game back then, but it was I kind of had a lot of expectations. I was very combat focused and, spent a lot of time building combat encounters. This was mostly in the 4th edition D&D days. And I'd always kind of seen on the periphery, DMs who talked about the fact that they build these great adventures and then the characters would go left and then your whole adventure falls apart, right? And it was always sort of the anecdote, and it still is. Like there's memes about how you prep this whole thing and then they choose to go a totally different direction. And more kind of professional game designers talked about it, and I paid more attention to that. And then as the game kind of began to change, like D&D went from 4th edition to 5th edition, and there was like a 2-year period where we were playing the D&D Next playtest. And that's where I got a hint, both as a designer, because I worked with Wizards back then on one of the initial D&D Next adventures called Vault of the Dracolich with Scott Fitzgerald Gray and Teo Sabadia. And I remember working with our WotC handler, who was Greg Bilsland back then. He's no longer with Wizards of the Coast. He moved into video games now, but he was our producer. And I remember like giving him stuff that was like 4th edition kind of design. I'd done a lot of 4th edition design for Wizards on Dungeon and Dragon magazine, so I was kind of used to doing that kind of thing. And he's like, yeah, that's not how this works anymore. And I'm like, what do you mean that's not how it works anymore, right? And so I had to kind of learn the hard way about like nonlinear dungeons, right? And all sorts of different designs. And then I played it too, right? And I remember playing I think it was the first public playtest of D&D Next. And I lucked out and got to play my first D&D Next playtest game run by Monty Cook, back when Monty Cook was on the design team. He was contracted by Wizards of the Coast to work on 5th edition, and did it for about a year, I think. And he was running it, and we were running the Caves of Chaos, right? The Keep on the Borderlands dungeon area. And so that was their kind of default group. And I remember talking to other DMs that were talking to other players that were playing it, and everybody had a completely different story about what happened when they were running that same adventure. So even though we were like in this penned off area of 26 different groups, in some cases we got killed by an ogre, in other cases we got lost in the Minotaur maze, and another one we got killed by goblins, another one we got killed by kobolds, and another one we managed to get the goblins and kobolds to have 2 people get married, and we had a big wedding ceremony. And it was like they all went in different realms, and I just remember thinking like, this is a different, it's a very different kind of game now, right? And there was this sort of opening, this freedom that sort of came where the story of the game started to go in all sorts of different directions. And part of that was you weren't building these big, heavy combat encounters that had to happen, right? 4th edition was like, you knew how long battles were going to take. They were like an hour to an hour and a half. And if you're going to run an adventure and you have 3, you better get to those battles because it's going to take a long time. So yeah, so that was when I really started thinking about it more and more, and talking to DMs who had kind of recognized this for a while. And I did a big poll of DMs. I don't remember how many. It was like 600 or 700 people back then, I think, about how their style, how long they prepped, and what they spent their time and attention on, and all that. And again, kind of right in the middle of the D&D Next playtest. And I interviewed a bunch of DMs that I knew, about 12 or 14 of them, and asked them a bunch of questions about their design, their prep styles. And then I wrote the original Lazy Dungeon Master, kind of based on that, based on my own observations, based on all this stuff that I'd sort of picked up. And it was still during the D&D Next playtest. So 5th edition wasn't out when that book came out. And I think the benefit that book and then later Return brought is it gave people, it gave them a life preserver in a big black sea, right? And like, if you read the Dungeon Master's Guide, and there's like been recent reviews of the Dungeon Master's Guide in some of my podcasts that I listen to, and friends of mine that have been talking about it, and like, it's not a big help, right? It really, they point at the Dungeon Master's Guide points at the starter set and says, if you want to be a DM, start with the starter set. And then the Dungeon Master's Guide is really for experienced DMs, and it's a toolbox for you to use to kind of build your own games. But nobody just says like, here's how to prep a game, right? Here's what to spend your time on. And I don't claim that. So obviously, like, the original Lazy Dungeon Master and Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master have 2 totally different styles for looking at this. And there's still many people that prefer one over the other. And there's some that only read one and only read the other, and they go with what they've got. But the fact that there's 2 different ones show you that I don't know which one it is, or it would have been the same. So it feels like anything is a help, right? And if the guidance works at all, it's better than nothing, right? And I think that a lot of people have used both styles, and certainly I think at this point many more people are using the style of in Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, and the feedback is pretty good. I haven't really had anybody who's come back and said, hey, I tried it and it totally didn't work. I've had people who have said, I read it and it's not for me, and I've got a style and I like it, and I'm like, that's awesome, right? And also awesome is when they say, I've got a style and I like it, but I dug your idea of secrets and clues, so I put that in. I'm like, great. Perfect, right? And then there are some that are like, yeah, I use the checklist every time and it works great. And you're like, okay, that's great too. It's not the end all be all of DM prep, but I think it is. It's a book that hits a mark, which is there really isn't anything out there. The starter set doesn't really help you build adventures. The starter set helps you run Lost Mine of Phandelver.
Exactly.
And then the Dungeon Master's Guide is like, okay, let's talk about the gods. And you're like, wait, what? You know, like, how about I got people coming over in a half hour, right? Like, I don't want to set up a pantheon. I want to run an adventure, right?
Exactly.
So I think that's where Return really helped. It's also not a long book, and it's designed from the get-go to be something that is easy to read, right? Like, you can pick up any part of it. And it's got, a couple chapters in the beginning that pretty much outline everything else in the book. So I talk about how modular the book is supposed to be to try to work well. And so, so that resonated. People seem to dig that, and I couldn't be happier about it.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that modularity is really integral to how easy it was to dig into it, because I think in the book you even say you don't need to read the whole thing. You just need to read what you need to know at the time.
Yeah, right. Skim it, right? Like it was written very purposefully to be a skimmable book. Like, you should be able to spend 10 minutes and understand what's in that book. And you should be able to spend 15 minutes and fix on the things that you don't know about. And then you could spend a couple hours and read the whole thing. Right. Yeah. So, it's not long, and it's designed so that you can sort of pick up the parts that you dig. One thing we did is I have this 8-step process that's kind of the core of the book, and it's the first 9 chapters of the book. And one of the chapters is, here's the 8 steps and a brief description of each of them. And that's the part that I gave away. So you can actually get the bulk of what Return has, and probably the most important thing that Return has, you can get for free by going to the website and picking it up. The preview has the thing that I think is most vital in the book. I don't try to hide it. I try to bury it. So
the Colvian approach of front loading.
Yeah, right. Try to give them as much as you can up front. Yeah.
And I think it's interesting to hear the origin story, because I had no idea that it came about during 5th edition's early playtesting. And you were mentioning how 5th edition was changing, and I didn't realize that story was so much more obviously integral off the bat. I thought that was a progressive, the change that came through more as Critical Role rose in popularity. I thought that was the cause, not an effect.
I can't speak for the world, right? I know that for me, that was the big shift, going in and playing D&D Next and seeing how that played out, and recognizing that not every battle has to be this huge set piece thing that you're spending tons of time on, and that you can have short fights, and you can have fights in the theater of the mind, and that it brought about a flexibility. I think 5th edition its design has a lot more flexibility to let a game go in different directions that I don't think 4th edition had. You can't really improvise a battle in 4th edition. You can't just sort of roll a random table and build something and go. I always had to have a pretty well-defined arena and, terrain effects and a mix of monsters that are of different types with, artillery and brutes and whatever. And there's probably other people that are totally disagree with that. But I played a lot of 4th, and I read a lot about 4th, and I wrote a lot about 4th. And that was kind of what I found. And as soon as that structure got broken, it meant that I had a lot of flexibility to run games in a different style. So, did other people pick it up because they saw streaming games and they saw the story focus of streaming games? Maybe, but I think that there were a few of us. There was also probably a lot of people who didn't really play 4th, who probably never let go of that. That was D&D to them, in the first place. If they were playing OD&D or 2nd edition, 5th edition feels pretty similar to that. 3rd edition, probably not as much. 3rd edition has a lot of, mechanical heft. And I think that 3rd edition sort of led into that heavy combat focus more so. But I know lots of people that played 3rd edition and Pathfinder and kept that story focused approach.
Yeah, I mean 3rd edition feels a lot like the game is the mechanics and playing all the numbers and the routine of it, rather than necessarily telling a story.
Yeah. I think that, and I sort of leaned into that, right? When I played 3rd, I leaned into the mechanics. And then when 4th came out, I leaned into the mechanics there too. And then, saw this sort of different way and started changing my style. And now I'm much looser. I hang on a lot looser to the mechanics, and I'm a lot less worried about balancing battles. And I'm a lot less, I'm interested to hear the stories that come up, and it's so much fun to play games and at the end go, wow, I had no idea that was going to happen. I just love that.
But yeah, I mean, I've also heard that 5th edition's Dungeon Master has in general been received as one of the worst Dungeon Master guides of the editions.
Yeah, I don't think that's fair. I mean, so it's hard to say. I think people are, my feeling is that people have rose-colored glasses on when they're looking back at 4th edition. I see a lot of high 4th edition praise, and my big argument is like, where the hell were you when I was playing it? Right? Like, I was in the middle of this. I was writing this stuff, and I picked up the, I have the 4th edition Dungeon Master's Guide sitting here because I was looking at skill challenges and stuff like that, and I don't find it to be that much better, right, than the other ones. And there's a lot of stuff in like the 1st edition Dungeon Master's Guide that doesn't make any sense at all. So it's hard to say that 5th edition is worse than that, right? Like, I like the 1st edition Dungeon Master's Guide, and as a historical artifact, it's great. But as a book that's going to help you learn how to DM, I mean, come on, speed factors and stuff, right? Like, so.
And 3rd edition had 2 of them.
Yeah, well, and 4th edition did too, right? 4th edition had a 1st and 2nd, and I think people really like the DMG 2 for 4th edition. A lot of it because they got Robin Lawson to write about player archetypes and stuff like that. I think that, I mean, my opinion on the DMG. So it is what it is because we have it, and here it is. I think it's structured weirdly. Again, I think the last thing in the world you need to do is start throwing people into pantheons, and it's literally the first chapter in the book. I think that it could have done a better job of walking people through the process of running a game. I think that Wizards really felt like 5th edition was going to call back to people. I think that when they sat down and said, what are we going to do with 5th? It was, how are we going to bring all the old veterans back to D&D? Right. And they had no idea that they were about to have 5 times more players than they have that have only played nothing but 5th. Right. Which is, I think, where they are now. Like, they've had, more people. I think this is true. More people have only played 5th than have played all of the other editions combined. Yeah. Right. I think if you look at the statistics that they've been regularly throwing out, and I can't cite it all right now, but I think that that's correct. I think that, they've had a huge surge in people coming into D&D through 5th, which also tells me like it can't be that bad. Right. Like, you wouldn't have people playing, but there are a lot of people like, yeah, I played 5th and I never read the Dungeon Master's Guide. And you're like, well, that's sad. There's a lot of great stuff in there. There's a lot of great inspiration. I think there's a lot of, they have tons and tons of interesting tables that can help, inspire your own adventures. And I think it's lost if that's ignored. I think there's a lot of really interesting things in there. There's a ton of optional rules that people go on Twitter and write on their blogs about as though they invented them. And you're like, that's in the DMG. Or I really wish that Wizards had a system for X. And you're like, they have it. It's in the Dungeon Master's Guide, right? Like, it's in the core books, and you forgot, or you never read it. That's happened more than once, where people have talked about either something they really wanted that they say is a shame that doesn't have, or they come up with a system that already exists. So I think like it's a weird book. It does have a design that's like, hey, we expect you already know how to DM, and these are this is the big toolbox for you to do it. And there isn't anything else that says like, but here's really how to do it. Right. And that's unfortunate.
Yeah. I almost wonder if it's intentional how they kind of go about introducing a lot of stuff. Like, I can put this a better way. Like, I personally have the problem that I'm a prep DM, like obsessively just like writing stuff in advance and creating things so that I'm not going to be ambushed on the fly, which inevitably happens anyway. Right.
Yeah, I have a book that can help you out.
Yeah, exactly. I'm super reliant on it. But yeah, I find that the DMG and Dungeons and Dragons books in general don't really write in a way that is against that play style. It almost encourages it by giving you all these extra tools and things to play with. Like, I wonder if that's an intentional design feature.
I think what they have a problem. Wizards is in an interesting. They have an interesting dilemma, which is they have to call back to the 50-year history of D&D. Right, they can't throw it away. They tried with 4th and it didn't go well, and I don't think it would be successful. I mean, a lot of people are like, oh, they surely should. They should throw all this stuff away and just make a new game. It's like, well, all of us can do that, right? Like, anybody outside of Wizards can write any kind of game we want, and many have. They have to remember the fact that they are Dungeons and Dragons and that they have a 50-year D&D history there. So when they write a Dungeon Master's Guide, they can't build it around one style. They have to say, we recognize that many, many people have many different styles that they use to play, including high prep, heavily plotted games, and games that are completely 100% improv. So how do we give tools that help both? So they're not in a stage where like me, where it's like, hey, I'm just going to make a system, right? Like I'm going to make 8 steps and I'm going to write about those 8 steps. And if you don't like it, that's fine. And if you do, great, right? And I can get away with that. If they did it, they'd be betraying 80% of their audience who doesn't use 8 steps, right? So they have a lot of stuff in there. And it's interesting because like in the world building section of the Dungeon Master's Guide, I have an opinion, which is spiral development. Start where the characters are, start with the town they're in, worry about descriptions of the things that you need in the adventure, and then expand only as you need new stuff to fit the adventures that are going on. Don't worry about building giant histories until you suddenly need one, right? And then do it, right? Worry about it only when you need it. You know, what gods should you worry about? Only the gods that the characters need, right? Or that the bad guys are using. And then don't worry about the other pantheon because it's not coming into play. And they talk about gods and pantheons in the beginning of the book, but then they have a section about world building that says like you should start with, one option is to start where the characters are and spiral out. So it's like, okay, well, they said it too, right? It's just it's buried in a 300-page book. They have all kinds of stuff. There's a concept that I only just learned about called point crawls, which is a way to do like overland travel where you are focused on the specific interesting locations that the characters run into while they're traveling, rather than like a hex-based or mile-based approach, right? And I've kind of fallen in love with it, and I've been using it a lot now. And they talk about it in the Dungeon Master's Guide. They don't call it point crawls, but they talk about wilderness travel, and they say like, you can use distances with hex values and miles and all that, or you can focus on locations and kind of ignore the, abstract the distances between them. And so it's like they have it in there, but they have to offer all of them. They can't just say, just use point crawls. Like, this style of game, we use point crawls, because they'd be abandoning, 70% or 80% of dungeon masters who use something else.
Yeah.
So they're stuck in that mode where they have to support everything. If it was a part of D&D, if it's part of D&D's history, they kind of have to stick with it, where none of the rest of us have to worry about that, and that to me is kind of an interesting situation. And we'll see what they do, right? They're going to keep doing things in the future, and they're going to change things. Maybe they'll decide they can be more opinionated about it, But most of the time, I think what's been working for them is what they've been doing with Tasha's and Xanathars, which is here's a bunch of options, right? And you can kind of pick the options that you like.
Yeah, I think we've discussed it on the show a few times about how things seem to be trending more towards modularity, the idea of just presenting a scattershot of different ways of doing things and letting the DMs figure it out.
Yeah, yep. And I think they do that in the Dungeon Master's Guide. I think the problem is a lot of people are coming in new and they just need something. It's like giving me a giant box full of 15 different ways to do things isn't exactly that useful. Give me one that works.
Yeah,
right?
It's like you're not looking for DLC, you're looking for the manual.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, and the DMG very much feels like a book full of DLC. Yeah, which is great. Like I love it. I use it, and I recommend people read it. A couple times a year, or like give it a good skim. Flip through the pages a couple times a year and remember what's in there, because you can use it in your game, and it's a shame not to.
Absolutely. But I do think that I disagree on one point, which is that I think that your particular guide to DMing actually complements the whole prep mentality much more. In at least that it encourages you to aim your prep in the right direction.
Yep.
Because so often when I'm doing stuff, like I would end up preparing like a myriad of things that didn't necessarily matter, or that certainly I wasn't preparing things that would. And your particular design definitely encourages you to create the right things that you're going to need along the way.
Yeah, that's the hope. Yeah, definitely. That like we can steer our prep, steer our prep to the right locations and leave the right things blank that should be left blank, so that the game has room to grow. The story has room to grow at the table. Yeah,
and in a very natural way as well.
Yeah. And it's working for me. It's working for me. It's working for other people I talk to.
Yeah.
And it's so much better. Like it's so much fun. The kinds of stories that are happening in my games these days, and I get giddy thinking about them. Like, oh, that's so wild that happened. Right? I had a whole dungeon maybe ready that I didn't use because they didn't need to. because they end up convincing the mayor of the town to, hang the person that they were going to go hunt down. And next thing they went outside and there she is hanging from a scaffold. They're like, well, that whole thread went away, and it was great. Like, I didn't lose anything. I didn't spend 2 hours, prepping that whole thing or getting battle maps ready or getting all my tokens together. It was like, if it happens, I'm ready for them to go there. If they don't go there, that's fine too. And that was a lot of fun. It's been a lot less stress. I'll certainly say that. Like, I've not been like, it's rare now that I worry about, oh man, they went in a direction and I'm totally not ready. It's been rare for me to hit that. Every so often it happens, but it's less common than it used to be.
Yeah, I mean, I almost at this point get the feeling that if you run into that problem, then you're probably approaching the game from the wrong direction.
Yeah, I mean, wrong is always a tough balance. A different way that may not be working for you. Right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah. And I mean, because there have been other sides where like, oh, I'm a big fan of like Jquay style dungeoning, where you have multiple ways that you could sort of get into a location, right? Like multiple paths, loop backs, secrets, and all sorts of things. And I had this like temple, and I realized like there's only the front door of the temple. I'm like, there ought to be a sewer entrance too. And then I didn't plan the sewer entrance at all. I didn't even have a map. And then they're like, oh, we're going to the sewer entrance. I'm like, oh, uh-oh, like save me, Dyson Logos, right? And, luckily Dyson Logos got 900 maps on his website, and I could go find a sewer real quick. So, that's also part of that prep, is knowing where to go when you suddenly need a sewer map and you don't have one. And then it's like, I don't have any encounters. I don't have any NPCs. I got no location descriptions. I have to make it up as I'm going. And that was a little stressful. Like, I should have spent 15 minutes having a sewer, having a general understanding of what the hell's going to happen if they go in the sewer. Because I did offer a sewer. So, so that happens from time to time.
Yeah, I suppose we're as much in that situation as anyone, that we're only as good as our tools.
Yeah, right. And luckily the tools are really, really good these days.
Oh, yeah.
Like we've got lots of stuff that helps, and it's been a real interesting time playing online. And it's going to be really interesting going back to playing at a table again. I don't know what that's going to be like. It's going to be really wild.
I'm in the same situation. I think my players have been so involved with like using video chat just for work that they're at the point where they mentally can't separate the idea of work from video chat. So we just can't play over like VoIP anymore.
Yeah.
But, well, we're getting there. So hopefully we'll be able to play in person again soon at some point.
Yeah, I'm hoping so. Yeah. I'm planning on it.
So yeah, I suppose, is there like any systems outside of D&D that you're a particular fan of?
Oh yeah, I got lots of systems I love. So I think, well, I'm a real fan of Ironsworn, and there's actually a new Ironsworn Kickstarter out right now. I forget the name of it. Let me pull it up. It is Starforged. Ironsworn Starforged just came out by Sean Tompkin. And it's a solo or small group RPG built on the bones of Powered by the Apocalypse, and with a little bit of Fate. Mostly Powered by the Apocalypse, but a fair bit of Fate and its own, sort of own revisions to it. And it's just packed with really interesting ways. It's really good DM training, cross training, because even in solo play, you're building stories as you're going, and you're letting the dice kind of move the stories around. Really, really fun. And some of the best random tables I've seen in any RPG. I love, he just managed to fit exactly the right inspiration, for the RPG, for fueling your mind for ideas. And I'm jealous of that. Like, as a guy who's spending a lot of time these days writing random tables, I'm jealous of how good he is at it. So I like that one a lot. I like Blades in the Dark, but I've never played it. But I dig it as an idea, and I really am hoping to play it. I love Numenera. The Monty Cook Games Numenera is a fantastic RPG. That one that I wish I could play more of. I love the optimism. I love the focus on exploration and discovery rather than just fighting and combat and murder hoboing. It's just a beautiful game. The art is fantastic. The design is great. I have a couple of tiny little quibbles with the system itself, but they're far outweighed by the quality of the material. I think it's a absolutely outstanding game whose the production quality of that is at least as equal to what Wizards is putting out for D&D. Like, they put out just gorgeous books. And I back like almost all of their Kickstarters. They also experiment a lot. So I'm real interested in watching them as a company, a small RPG company that's experimenting a lot with things. So I like Numenera. Shadow of the Demon Lord, which is like the absolute polar opposite of Numenera, right? It's a game of just blood and gore and death and horror. And written by Robert Schwab, who is a industry veteran for multiple editions of D&D. Actually has done work on Numenera, as Monty Cook has done work on Shadow of the Demon Lord. So there's a bit of cross work there. I'm sorry, I keep banging my microphone.
It's fine.
And then it makes the springs on my, the springs all rattle, and then you can hear it. So yeah, Shadow of the Demon Lord is fantastic, crazy, dark RPG. My group played it. We played an 11 session campaign. It's a game designed to be played in 11 sessions.
Oh, wow.
You level once every session. So you start off as level 0 and you get up to level 10. And it's all about the world ending. The world is ending in some terrible way, and you're there either shepherding it or dealing with it, or in mind trying to stop it. But I think the intent is you can't really stop it.
Sort of a 10 Candles vibe.
Yeah, and boy, I don't know anybody that can write as much as Schwab can. Like I wonder I haven't seen him putting out a lot of stuff recently. And I imagine we're going to get a dump truck worth of new stuff from him. I hope, because the quality of the material for a one-man shop, the stuff that's coming out for Shadow of the Demon Lord is just crazy good. I just bought some new things today, and it's a really interesting model. If you can stomach the crazy gore, and dark nature of it. I love Fate. The Fate Condensed, I think, is maybe I don't know. It's pretty great. Maybe my favorite RPG system. Mm-hmm. Like just from a mechanic standpoint, like, you can do anything, right? You can do anything with it. And it's got just enough chewy mechanics to make it a game and not just pure storytelling. But you can rewire it around any genre you want. And I think that's really cool. And the whole model is Creative Commons, so you can build your own RPG around it. And I've done so. And so I like that one a lot. And there's many others. Zweihander is really cool. Yeah, so there's lots of RPGs. 13th Age, I forgot to mention 13th Age, not because it's not great, but 13th Age. If I wasn't playing 5e, I'd probably be playing a lot more 13th Age as far as a fantasy RPG goes. And for anybody that, I think it's, again, I'm saddened by all of the pro 4e discussions that are going on saying, go play 13th Age. It is 4e. Like it's was written by two guys, one that did the design work on 3.5 and one that did the design work on 4e, and they got together and made this. And it's a wonderful system, and it's a high power, high fantasy, character. You roll your attack rolls and you roll 10d10 damage. It's superhero, super heroic fantasy, and it's also beautiful and a really fun game. My group played a fair bit of it. In this sort of D&D Next time period, we played a lot of different systems, and that was one that we all go back to and enjoyed.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely heard of people using 13th Age as their stepping stone for staying on the course of 4th edition. Yeah,
good. Yeah, I'd love to see more of that. I think it deserves, I think it feels like it deserves more attention than it's getting, because it's just, it's a great fun system.
It's interesting how Dungeons & Dragons kind of blossoms off into, like, if you want to keep playing 3.5, you join Pathfinder. If you want to keep playing 4th edition, there's 13th Age. Like,
sure, yeah. And that's great, right? Like, there's a system for everybody, and you don't have to just pick one. Like, we're not locked in, right? No one's locked into a system. We can play whatever we want, right? And that's awesome, right? Like, I love that about this hobby. And, I think it's a big question of, like, well, D&D is what's bringing everybody in, and will they stay? And it's is the rising tide really raising all boats, or is it only raising all boats for stuff that is going towards 5th edition, right? Like Monty Cook Games has made a strategic decision to support more 5e stuff, right? And Monty Cook is the one that left Wizards of the Coast in the middle of the 5e development cycle. So I can't imagine he was super happy about it, right? And I know Rob Schwab dipped his toe in too. He did a couple of 5th edition things. And I think he wrote on Twitter that he's like, I just can't do it. Like, I just don't dig it. And I like my own stuff more. And even though it would sell, and even though I might be able to do something there, I want to do my own thing. Right. And so that, that's interesting and, I don't know, sad maybe. I don't know. We'll see. Like I said, I just hope he brings up a dump truck worth of new stuff, because I'll totally buy it.
Yeah. I mean, my first season of this particular show was basically a character arc of me discovering that I can't homebrew my way out of the problems I have with 5th edition.
Interesting.
Like, I just got to the point where I was adding so much content, it just wasn't D&D anymore. And it was just easier to play something else or make my own games.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting because I was actually, one of the things that kind of clued me into, I think D&D is an outstanding design, right? There's lots of quibbles and I got problems. But, generally speaking, when I look at it, I go back to, the population of D&D players doubled twice in 4 years. Hard to say that it's broken. I hear a lot of people that are like, 5th edition is broken. You're like, not really. Like, I'm playing it. Lots of other people are playing it. Like,
exactly.
It's working.
And you got to give it its due. Like, 5th edition, the one thing it does better than any other edition is introduce new players to the universe, like, of TTRPGs.
Yeah, I guess, almost by accident, right? Like, I don't know if it's actually that good at doing that, but it did it. So if anything, at least it's not in the way. Like, there's good arguments to be made, I think, that it isn't an outstanding entry ramp into RPGs, because I think it was designed to bring people in that knew how to play already. That's an assessment, the theory of mine, right? But it doesn't get in the way, right? It is simpler. It is easier. Building a character isn't too hard. Learning the rules isn't hard. I've taught lots of new people how to play. I've taught some friends and family
crazy
members.
accessible.
Yeah, it's very accessible. Is it the most accessible? Probably not. Like, Fate's pretty accessible. I've run Fate with 4-year-olds, right? And I don't think I could run D&D with 4-year-olds. So I think that, like, 5th edition, it's not in the way of people's problems, right? It's not getting in the way. And I know. So I looked at 5th edition, and it's funny because, like, in 3rd, I had tons of house rules. I had, like, I think I even said, like, you can't play any of the characters from the player's handbook, right? You can only play characters from, like, the Book of Nine Swords and the Tome of Magic and these other later ones that had designs that fit the style of D&D I wanted to play. And with 4th edition, it was the same thing. I said, like, we got to the point where I was like, we're going to play what I refer to as an essentials only campaign, which is, it's 4th edition, but only with the D&D 4th edition essentials books, not with the original Player's Handbook 1 and 2, because the design of those is just not nearly as good as the essentials designs. And I had tons of house rules for both systems. And I started that way a little bit with 5th when I was like, it feels like moon druids are really way more powerful than they ought to be. And my argument for that is, you don't see any of the other Circle of the Land. You only see Circle of the Moon, right? So that shows me that Circle of the Moon is probably too powerful. And then I realized, like, it's not that bad, right? Like, sure, you can constantly turn into brown bears and beat the crap out of people, but it really only matters at, like, 3rd level. Like, as soon as you get to, like, 4th and 5th level, those monsters aren't, the things you can change into aren't nearly as good as they used to be. So I had a house rule about, like, I forget, I don't even remember what it was, but something like, it bothered me that druids had, like, basically stackable piles of hit points and no repercussion if they dropped out of it, And then I took it away because I'm like, I don't think it matters. Like, the house rule I had there didn't matter. And then I basically ran, 5 or 6 campaigns, hundreds and hundreds of sessions, with no house rules at all. Like, I'm just, stock 5e, right? Like, everything's fine. I had DM stuff that I did, little bits of trickery on my side, but, like, I don't have to tell them what I'm doing, right? And, so it was, I mean, unless you count things like trying to do combat with zones and having descriptions of how zone-based combat works in 5th, that's not even really a house rule, right? That's more like it's kind of a house rule. It's almost like a style thing. It doesn't have a rule book. I can explain it in 3 sentences and people get it. So it's not really that bad.
I mean, I know what you're talking about, but for the sake of the audience.
Sure. So, like, a zone-based system is and Fate has this, and 13th Age kind of has this with abstract distances. But when you're running Theater of the Mind, it can be difficult to say, like, well, who's near who and how are people grouped up. So what you essentially do is you say that, like, an encounter area or combat area has zones, and a zone is defined by a feature, like the throne. The throne dais could be a zone, and the entry hall could be a zone, and the hallway of statues could be a zone. And your character can be in any one zone. And then when somebody does, like, a fireball, you say, well, you can hit any of the people in any one of those zones, rather than saying, like, well, how do you figure out how many people are inside of a fireball when you're trying to do Theater of the Mind? Right. And so by just saying, like, you want to hit everybody at the throne, you can fire the fireball at the throne, you'll hit everybody that's on the throne. including your friends, right? And so like we've been doing that recently, you know, a kind of a tiny little house rule. We have a Twilight cleric from Tasha's in our group. And I had to explain in talking with the player, we said, okay, in a zone, it's a 30-foot radius. And he was like trying to stand on the edge of two zones to hit both. And I said, you can only affect the people in one zone, right? Like, and he's like, okay, got it, right? Like as soon as he got it, clicked, and like, you want to walk around with the thing, you got to go to the other zone. And that means the people in the other zone aren't getting it. So kind of house ruly a little bit, but not really, right? Like, I don't know. I don't really count it. So what interests me is that in 5-6 years, however long we've been playing 5th edition, I have hardly any house rules. Like, I don't think I really have any, and it's fully playable, you know, and that's great. Like I didn't have that for any other system. And that's one of the things where I'm like, I kind of don't want them to make a new one because I don't have any confidence that they're going to make one that's better, right? Like we've had edition after edition after edition, and some were better and some were worse and some were good in one ways and not in others. Whatever they come out with, whenever they come out with it, it's going to have other problems we're going to have to deal with. Well, I already know how to deal with the problems I got now, right? I don't need new problems. So I'm much more conservative on the side of like, you know, I kind of hope they stay to 5e for a while longer because nothing's broken, right? 4th stuff was broken, right? Like I had to, they had 100-page errata for 4th edition, and 3rd, like the glut of new stuff coming out made it impossible to have any idea like what was going on. 4th too, like 4th had 10,000 feats or something.
Wow.
So yeah, it's crazy.
Well, it's interesting that in 3rd edition and 4th edition, you almost had to innovate through limitation, while 5th edition, you innovate through addition. Like I find a lot of people using homebrew stuff now, and certainly the homebrew like community has exploded in popularity, I think. Yeah.
I kind of hope it explodes more. And I think D&D Beyond is actually holding people back. You know, one thing is like I'm kind of critical of Tasha's. Like there are things in Tasha's that I look at and I'm like, how did they come to this? Right? Like that doesn't. I mean, my current bugaboo is Twilight clerics. I think they're way too powerful compared to other classes, and I have some good data to tell me like how many times does a Twilight cleric use Channel Divinity that isn't Twilight Sanctuary, right? And the answer is 0. Because why would you? Because Twilight Sanctuary is so much better than everything else. You know, what about Turn Undead? No, we're not doing that. We're doing Twilight. So I think there are a lot of sources of new subclasses and new character options and stuff like that. Sorry, bang the mic again. There are so many new ones that as long as they're going through some thorough playtesting, I think they'd be great. Like Kobold Press, I know, is playtesting their stuff. 2C Gaming is playtesting theirs. You know, a lot of different groups are putting out character options that are playtested, and that's all I want, right? I just want to know that somebody went through the trouble of running these and tried to balance them, so I don't have to. It's a lot different than just grabbing any old thing that shows up in the DM's Guild. You know, I want something that's had some level of rigor. I mean, the Ill Rigger, right? Speaking of rigor, the Ill Rigger from Matt Colville, like Matt Colville, MCDM, has a tremendous playtesting group, and they have a full-time playtest coordinator who just manages playtesting that stuff. I'm pretty sure the Ill Rigger is probably fine, right? Matt Colville or Matt Mercer's 2 classes that he's got up in the DM's Guild, like I forget what it is, the Blood Hunter is one, yeah. But isn't there a gunslinger type?
He's got like a subclass for gunslingers, I think.
Okay. Yeah, I thought he had 2, but maybe it's just Blood Hunter. But like, boy, I know that went through multiple revisions of playtesting. You know, it went up on the guild, and I remember seeing like iteration after iteration after iteration as hundreds of people played it. Right. And it's like, okay, I trust that one. You know, if a player came to me and said, I'd really like to try this, I'd be like, okay, let's see. You know, and part of that is like, I feel like WotC's quality went down on subclasses and other ones went up. So you're like, okay, I'm a lot more open to that these days. But I think people like D&D Beyond, and it's hard when D&D Beyond doesn't have third-party stuff like this available. That's kind of a bummer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, yeah, we're definitely seeing that, like, within the homebrew communities I'm part of, there's a lot of innovation going on. I think a lot of people obviously don't have the resources that, like, MCDM and Matt Mercer do. But within the community itself, if you got one person making homebrew, you've definitely got them also playing it, testing it in their own games. And I think, you can definitely get some like work out of it, but you're hugely reliant on people just taking an interest.
Sure. Yeah. And it's a lot of stuff, right? And it's real. I mean, a lot of stuff is coming out. A lot of people are making things. It's really hard to know, right? It's really hard to and it's really hard to tell the difference between something that's going to work well and something that's not.
Yeah.
And it can be really tough if you have a player who picks a subclass and they like it a lot, and then suddenly there's broken bits, and now you've got to like design on the fly. Now, the other thing is you can. So like I would probably say if people were coming to my game and saying, hey, I've got this weird subclass from this place I want to use, I'd say like, okay, but I give veto privileges at any point, right? And like we will sit and look at it, because I kind of have to do that now with first party classes, right?
Yeah.
And my friend who's running the Twilight Lair, he's like, I'll accept a nerf if you want, and I'm like, no, I want to feel the pain. But like it wouldn't be out of hand to come up with little house rules on the fly that sort of tweak something to make sure it's balanced.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, we'll see.
And it's also interesting, like, that D&D is one of the few games out there which changes so dramatically between editions. I mean, most games, they only
certainly
make like
these
minor
last
adjustments.
3. Yeah, right. These last 3 are completely different from one another. And, I think a lot of people have hypothesized, and I know some of the other early designers on 5th made statements like, if we come out with a 6, it's going to be backward compatible with 5th. Right. And I'd be very interested to see them, do that. I think, we look at the kind of things they've done in Tasha's, right? The sort of quality of life improvements that they've made in Tasha's that I think many cases are great. And you think like, what if those were baked in instead of in a supplementary book? Or what if they liked some of those things and made them? But wouldn't it be interesting if there were 6th edition characters that sat beside 5th edition characters and they still worked? That would be, I don't think they've ever done that, right? Like even 3 to 3.5, I don't think you could play one right next to the other. Or if you could, it was only for a short amount of time. And then clearly the 3.5 was different.
Yeah. Was Essentials anything like that?
Yeah. So that's true. So going from 4th edition to D&D to 4th edition Essentials, which many consider like 4.5, you could definitely play those side by side. Yeah. They were fully compatible. But it's such a tight window between, it was only 4 year period of time between the beginning of 4th edition and the end of 4th edition. Yeah. And Essentials came out like 2 years in. So, it was a rapidly burning candle for 4th. But yeah, we'll see. Yeah, it'll be interesting.
There's definitely a lot to speculate on, and I don't know how much merit there is in like sitting and chatting about that. not a lot. Yeah. Like, you're not changing the world, right? Like they're going to do what they do. I'd love to speculate.
I know, but it's like a dozen people in, out in Seattle, and they're the ones that are going to do it. Right. And they're going to do whatever they're going to do, regardless of what anybody else says. So yeah, no, I agree with you. Like, we'll see.
So, if for more information, see my Reddit thread.
Yeah, exactly. Or anyone else's, right?
But yeah, I think also with the way they've approached Unearthed Arcana is basically like the Wizards' approach to please playtest our homebrew.
Yeah, pretty much. Right. Yeah, and it's always kind of fun to see what they do and what they throw at. I am disappointed that I feel like. I guess I'm kind of bitter this week, I guess. And I feel like they're not really serving DMs very well, right? Like there were the last time there's been an Unearthed Arcana that gave DM options is like 2 years ago. It's been a long time. And and Tasha's has DM stuff in it, but not a lot that really changed what I'm doing, right? Like Xanathar's has a lot more that helps me out as a DM. And Tasha's has, there's interesting things in there. I love the sort of, fantastic environment tables that they've got in there. Those are really cool. And, session 0 guidance is fantastic and ought to be there. But like I've been doing session 0, so they're not teaching me anything, but maybe that's, I don't know, like that. You want something to put in the beginning of the Dungeon Master's Guide, like session, no one was talking about it when the DMG came around. That's kind of a new popularity. But like that's something you want to give to a new DM and not bury in a supplementary book 100%. on page 130. So yeah, I feel like there's so many areas where 5th edition DMs could be better served. And of course my answer is, well, I guess I'll do it. right? Like, I'm working on a book now, and my book is, I joke about this is Sly Flourish's Dungeon Master's Guide 2, right? Like if I were writing the Dungeon Master's Guide 2, what would I write? And what would I want in it? And that's what I'm going to put in this, right? And, we'll see where it goes. I got lots of stuff. I got 60 pages.
I'm definitely interested to see.
Yeah. So, that's kind of the next, the third of the Lazy Dungeon Master, return, and the Lazy DM workbook. And then this one will be the sort of third volume in that.
Strikes back.
Yeah. It's Lazy DM's Companion is what it's going to be called.
Fantastic.
Probably. Yeah.
Do you think it's going to remain as like, I found like the first two to be surprisingly system agnostic. Do you think that's how you continue?
Yep. I think so. I was thinking about that because, I got to worry about like, well, what if I write this and next year 6th edition comes out? Although I don't think that's very likely. But, I want the books to last. And an easy way to kind of do that is to say, well, could I use this stuff with 3rd? Could I use it with 4th or 2nd at least, right? And I think the answer is probably about 80%. I think there'll be some stuff, that's going to be, pretty 5th edition specific. If they completely, and then again, we'll see what they do with 6, and maybe it would still work with 6. I'm not sure, but like I'm taking another take on encounter building guidelines, right? Like I've done this like 5 times, but it's not going to stop me from doing it again. And encounter building for 5th is like its own thing, right? It's different than how any of the other editions do it. So that little bit of math probably isn't going to work. But like running hordes, it basically does it the same way 13th Age does it. So if it works for 13th Age, it probably works for this. So I think there's a lot of it is just DM inspiration, like, how to hear frameworks for building adventures around a particular style. And that is completely agnostic. It's still fantasy RPG based, but I think you could probably use it with just about any fantasy RPG. Yeah.
Very nice. And do you think you'll have like any guest contributors at all, or?
Probably not. Like, I don't know. I'm selfish in that way. Like writing these things is what I want to do.
Yeah, it's your prerogative, man.
Yeah, and it's the part I like the best. I would love like a contributor program manager, like go handle the art orders, man. Like I don't want to do that. Go make sure the book is pretty when it comes out.
Yeah.
And I'm talking to people that I might partner with who can help on some of these things that like I'm just an amateur at, and I need help. And they can, they've done lots of projects like this before. So, doing that without giving away the farm, is a tricky bit. But luckily, there's some companies out there, third-party publishers who recognize that there's like a lot of creative people out there who want to make things and have no idea how to do it, have no idea how to run a Kickstarter, have no idea how to advertise on Facebook, who have no connections to offset printers, who have no way to handle storage or distribution to Amazon or any of the other million things that you've got to know in order to get a book out. And I know at least 2 companies that I've talked to, both of which now kind of offer that as a service. Like you come to us with your project, it's still yours, and we'll help you out, right? And we'll come up with some deal. We'll work out some deal between us on exactly what kind of split and what kind of workload split we're going to do. And you can do as much as you want, or you can do as little as you want, and that will affect the split that the cut that we take. And, so that's pretty great. Like that's not anything I've had before. And, so it'll be interesting to work with that.
Yeah. And I mean, we've heard before from, Genuine Fantasy Press and, Mage Hand Press about how difficult it is to self-publish. Like when you're just doing it solo, like both from the point of view of, print on demand and just like getting a batch order of prints and then having to deal with a deficit of cash, which you then have to remake by then selling it.
I guess my opinion is like, it can't be that hard because I did it. Right. Like, I had no experience in this. I'm not a book publisher, and everything I've done so far, I've done independently. I haven't had another group come in and handle it. And the ability to handle print on demand stuff now is so much easier. And working with Drive-Thru RPG is not hard. Like I've always had to hire a layout guy because I don't know InDesign, right? And then in some cases, like me and the layout guy and the drive-through specs have to work together until we get it just right. But I think that certainly it's easier than any other time that's ever been. right? Like, tell me about print on demand in the 80s. You know, right? Like, no one did it, right? So there wasn't print on demand. So yeah, so I think it's a great time. It's not easy. It's a lot of work. You know, I realized, I think when I was doing Ruins of the Grendelroot is my second set of 5th edition adventures that I did. I did a book called Fantastic Adventures, and another one called Fantastic Adventures, Ruins of the Grendelroot. And it was kind of either at the middle or the end of it that a couple things occurred to me. One was that writing the book was like 10% of the effort. Right. I wrote a 160-page book, and that was 10% of the effort. 90% was art orders, layout, editing, review, wrangling it into the various print-on-demand things, managing the Kickstarter, talking to customers, all the other parts of it, right, was like 90% of the work. And that's not the part that was exciting to me. Like, writing it was exciting. And I could tell where, like, it would have been really nice to be able to write a draft and be like, I'm done, and then throw it out the door. And then, like, start working on the next one. And then, like, oh, look at that, it came in. Hey, it looks great, right? And there are companies that'll do that, right? Like, nowadays there are people that can I could probably work out a deal with somebody for something like that. But I'm also a control freak, and I want to look exactly the way I want it to look, which means I'm going to be doing that work.
For sure.
And yeah, so it's hard, but I think, I don't know. I mean, can anybody do it? I don't know. But what are the barriers? Like, I'm not a graphic designer. I'm not a professional project manager. I'm not an art director. I'm not a publisher, and I managed to get a bunch of books out, right? And I think the limitations I have is like the going from print on demand to offset printing is a big deal, and that's one where, like, I'm just scared, and I keep going like, nah, I'm gonna go to print on demand, right? Because, like, I don't know what's goes on over there, and I hear horror stories. I talked to a major 5th edition publisher. And he brought up to me, he was like, how come you're not doing offset printing? Like, it's you're paying like $9 a book, and you could be paying like $1.50, right? Like, why is that happening? And I'm like, because I don't want to have a crate of books in my house and like be mailing stuff every day. And he's like, yeah. Yeah, that's true, right? And so he like stopped trying to sell me. He's like, yeah. He's like, I have a crate of of books for 3.5 in my house, and no one buying 3.5 stuff anymore. Right? So he's like, I literally have like a pallet of books that came out after 4th edition came out. Right? So yeah, so
it's like, Linux is free, but I don't necessarily want to work with the kernel myself.
Yeah, kind of, right? And Linux is free as long as you want to be a system administrator, right? And I hope you have fun being a system administrator, right? Like, so yeah, so I think it's easier than it's ever been. I think the other fantastic bit is, like, there are no gatekeepers, right? The metaphor I tell all the time, I'm like, I'll go onto Discord servers where people talk about it, and I'll see people on Twitter, and I'll see a lot of folks. And certainly there are world circumstances that are getting in the way of people being able to create their art. And I'm not talking about that. Like, the world is an unjust and unfair place for a lot of people, right? But when it comes to an ability, assuming you have the time and energy, which is a big assumption for a lot of people, right? Assuming you have the time and energy to make something, to write something, an adventure or a subclass or whatever, you don't need anyone's approval to be able to put it out there anymore, right? And we think we do. And that's like, if only Wizards of the Coast would discover me and let me write the next big hardcover adventure. Right. And it's like, you look at the people who wrote in their hardcover adventures, they had a bunch of stuff that they did before they did those hardcover adventures. So it's rare, it's rare to look at any of the authors that are published and be like, oh, they just came in and did this. It's like, no, they did a lot of stuff. MT Black had like 100 adventures written before Wizards said, hey, want to come work on Descent into Avernus? Right. So the idea that, like, you're waiting for some big corporation to love you, that's gone. And if you have a gatekeeper, it's yourself, right? And it's, again, not speaking to world circumstances that are in the way.
Yeah.
But
we make art, right? Like,
we make art, and you can put it up, right? And like, you could put it up in DM's Guild, you could put it up in Drive-Thru RPG, you could put it up on Amazon, you could just put it up on your own website, right? There's all kinds of ways to get your work out there now. And there's many different print-on-demand publishers now, right? I've got, my books are out both on Amazon print-on-demand and Drive-Thru RPG, right? And it's great, So
yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I think the world, like my dad was a professional author, and he had none of the kind of agency that I've got, and yeah, it's fantastic, right? Like this didn't exist back then.
Yeah, I mean, if you're listening to this and you're waiting for someone to give you permission to start like putting your work out there, like this is it. Go do it now.
Stop. Yeah, you have our permission. Go do it. Right. Yeah. And you shouldn't ask us anyway. The metaphor I love is from Blazing Saddles. There's a great scene in Blazing Saddles where all the brigands are coming to town. And they're like, we're not going to be ready, right? We got to go do something. And so they're like, I've got an idea. And then all of a sudden you see the brigands and they're in the middle of this big desert and they run up and there's a toll booth in the middle of the desert. And all of them are like, what the hell is this? And they're like, 10 cents, like someone's going to have to go back and get a barrel of dimes. And then they clip back to the town and the town's all building stuff. And then they clip to the brigands and they're all lined up, each one going through with the gate opening and closing for like 200 of them. Right. And you're like, and it's the middle of the desert, right? Like they ride right around it, but they stop. And that's the way I feel that a lot of people just getting started, they're putting these gates in front of them, or they're listening to somebody that's saying like, you really need to do X. I got a lot of criticism because I talked about, how much it costs to make an adventure. And I'm like, if you're making a 5,000 word adventure, it's about $2,000, right? For art and editing and layout. And all the things that you need to do to make a good quality adventure is about $2,000, right? And that's about how much it cost me to make one, right? And a lot of people are like, you're getting in the way. Like no one has $2,000 to spend on their thing. And I'm like, well, fine, don't, right? Like, and there are so many examples that tell me I'm wrong. Right? There's so many, like MT Black does not spend $2,000 on every adventure. He's starting to, and he has for some. But he's also like, no, I like doing them cheap. And guess what? Now I'm doing adventures that I'm giving away on Patreon. They didn't cost me $2,000. Some of them didn't cost me anything at all, right? Some of them cost me like $8 for licensable artwork that I added in there, right? So you don't need to spend that. And so don't listen to me. Right? Yeah. When I say something dumb like it's going to cost you $2,000 to make a good adventure, don't listen to me. Go do it, right? Do it for nothing. Do it for $50.
Like a good adventure is a good adventure. Like artwork and like layout and a PDF and everything, that's all just bells and whistles. If an adventure is good enough, it stands on its own feet, and you can put that on a G drive. You can just put that link out there.
That's right. Yep. Absolutely.
So it looks like the next book might be The Lazy GM's Guide to Publishing.
No, I have a book about how to I think I have a little guide on Kickstarter that I just like me keeping track of like what it was like to do a Kickstarter. And I update that every time I run one on things that I've learned. But even that is completely changing now. Like that whole environment is completely changing from when I started. So I have a feeling if I look back at my old stuff, I'd be like, and again, like I've been, I've done 6 Kickstarters or something. And I'm still like, I think I'm going to go hook my horse up to that cart because they know more than I do about all this. And then I did one about, I did one on self-publishing too, a long time ago, and like how to get a Kindle book up and stuff like that. Okay. And nobody cares, and it's not hard to kind of figure that out. I will offer one from a publisher standpoint, one killer tip that I have verified with many other RPG publishers, and something that like, God, I wish I had done 10 years ago. And that's start a newsletter, right? Like you want to really get into the best social media on the planet, get into email, right? Like Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, Discord, Reddit, ignore those. Email is the media of the future, right? And we joke about it, but I've got now a lot of statistics that show me that sales from email are so much stronger than sales from Twitter or Facebook or any of the other social media platforms, like 20 to 30 to 1, right? Like, way better response rate on email. And you don't, there's a million good guides about how to set up an email server, and they cost money, but like you own that network. Like that's your network, right? I got about 3,500 people on my email newsletter now. And like, I can move that wherever I want, right? Like I can go from one platform to another. Like that list, these are people that have come to me and said, I want to hear about Sly Flourish stuff, right? So it's not spam. I didn't buy a list, that I'm hitting. These people came and were, trusting enough to hand me their email address on the recognition that they're going to get an article every week to help them, learn, help them pick up some D&D tips. And then occasionally, like they will tomorrow, they'll get a thing that says, hey, one of my books is for sale for 60% off, right? And so if you ever wanted to get this book that isn't the most popular one on the planet, but now it's for sale for $6 instead of $15, now's the day to pick it up. And sending that out in email gets 20 to 30 to 1 response than putting the same thing out on Twitter. And I'm not even talking about getting followers. I'm talking about like views. So like I can look at the impressions on a tweet and see how many people saw a tweet, how many clicked the link, and how many bought what was there, right? And it's 30 times less than the number of people that see it through email, Now Twitter's free, right? So I'm going to put out tweets too, right? But I'm not worried about Twitter, and I'm not worried about Twitter growth. I'm worried about my email and making sure that people are subscribing that are interested in what I'm doing and that they know to do it. And I've talked to many publishers, big and small, about this. And they all say, yeah, our email lists are gold. Like that's when I'm talking about like hooking my cart up to a horse. I think I flipped the metaphor the other way. When I talk about one of the big reasons why I'm connecting my cart up to a bigger horse is they have a huge email list, right? And they can add in my book into their ongoing publications of like, look at all these new RPG things that are coming out, and people respond to that, and it's, so as a publisher, it's my only tip. My only tip that's probably really worth anything is to start an email account. Start up an email newsletter. And I've again talked to many people that have confirmed that is really valuable.
Amazing, and I think that's fantastic advice to end on. We're about up to time now.
Yeah,
but that's fantastic. Certainly unprecedented advice. We've never heard that before.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't think we've ever covered really like the idea of growing a fan base in that way.
Yeah. So, right. And it's probably been, getting attention onto your product is probably the hardest part of all of this, right? We all want to make stuff, but we also want people to see it. And I think people look at Twitter and how popular the idea of Twitter is and think that's how I'm going to get people. Like I'm going to build a Twitter audience up. And I've got the same friends that are building their email lists are also in some cases using either giveaways or other methods to try to build their Twitter audience up. And they're just like, yeah, I'm spending money there and I'm spending energy there and I'm spending time there and none of it's returning. Like there's not a return there that's valuable. And meanwhile, I get swept into drama. So it's like, email list over here is a lot more straightforward. So I definitely, I see the opposite too. I've talked to people who feel like Twitter is the way they're going to build their brand. And I don't think they're getting that. Twitter changes how it does things and you don't have any control over that.
Yeah.
So like this last year, they completely changed how people find the stuff that you put up on Twitter. People have switched. This is anecdotal. I don't have data, but they've switched their Twitter has a lot of people that are using Twitter switched from a timeline to show me the most popular stuff since the last time I'm here. And Twitter decides what's popular, what's not. And many of their algorithms are designed to keep you to their platform. They don't want you going off and going to another link. So I look at I've got sort of automated systems that say, hey, I put up a new YouTube video and I have it auto broadcast to my Twitter account. Hey, there's a new YouTube video up, right? And these are YouTube videos. On YouTube, they're getting a lot of views. They're getting thousands of views. On Twitter, nobody's leaving Twitter to go there. They get 100 impressions, right? And it's because Twitter doesn't want you to go to YouTube, right? Yeah. They don't care what you're putting there. So all of the platforms, particularly the social media platforms, are becoming insular, right? And you get your biggest audiences as long as you stay in that platform. So YouTube is the best platform to get people to watch your YouTube videos, not some other method. And Kickstarter, you can work your ass off to try to get people to find your Kickstarter. But Kickstarter, the website, is the one that's going to get you the most traffic to your Kickstarter internally, right? We saw this. We worked, on the last book where Scott Gray and James Intercasso and I did it. And like all of us, you know, are pretty big on social media platforms. All of us have a fair bit of experience working with this stuff. And we worked our asses off to try to get this book out in front of people. We tried Facebook ads, we tried Twitter, we did everything. And I think if you added all of the work we did, the real time and effort that we put in, all of that effort accounted for like 20 or 30% of the amount of people that backed it. And the other 70 to 80% was Kickstarter bringing in people. And we could have done that. That would have been no effort. That was no effort of us at all, right?
Yeah.
So all the platforms are getting better at staying in their platforms. And that's why if you have your own platform, you're in a much better spot, right? And email.
Like you're not caught in the spiral.
You're not caught, whatever Facebook decides to do, whatever Twitter decides to do, whatever YouTube decides to do. If you've got your own fan base of people that came to you and said, I'm interested in what you have to say, right? You know, and that is transferable from system to system, and you can use it for lots of different things, as long as you don't betray them, right? As long as you're not screwing them, right? My goal is not to sell things to these people. My goal is to make their lives better, right? And help them run better D&D games. It's the number one charge of everything I do. I don't care, you know, the money's not the driver. You know, the helping people run D&D games is the driver, and so that's what I try to do with that list, and that's what I try to do with everything I've got. So. And that's just one person's opinion. I've talked to a lot of people about it. I've studied it. I could be totally wrong, just like the $2,000 adventure. So,
I mean,
study it yourself.
It sounds about right for me, because I've heard more and more recently of like how these platforms, they aren't growing. Like their user base is stagnating, so they have to invest in keeping you in that system and engaging with it and finding new ways to like keep you trapped inside.
Right. I'd be surprised if YouTube wasn't growing. I did notice that like I got started late in YouTube stuff, you know, and you thought like, well, Colville's eating the market there, right? Like nobody, you know, there's so many WebDM and Colville and, you know, a dozen other really high profile DM advice people on YouTube. And I'm like, well, what the hell? And I get a lot of views and I get a lot of attention. And now like I did a poll on my Patreon. Patreon's its own whole other topic, but I did a poll on my Patreon, like, how'd you find it? Right. And the majority, not the majority, but the highest number of people of the like 5 different categories that I put in were YouTube. Right. That's how they found it. So I'm like, well, that's valuable. Right. It's one of the harder ones to do. It's way easier for me to write an article than to shoot a YouTube video. But people are finding it and they like it, you know, and I don't think that market is saturated yet. I think that, you know, one can put YouTube videos up on topics that are interesting. And again, it's because YouTube is really good about putting it in front of people.
Yeah. Like when I was first starting this show, I initially tried to start with Twitch, and I learned the hard way that Twitch is for once you've built an audience, because it doesn't rely on discovery. It's all about putting the most viewed people at the top of the view lists. Like if you're starting out, you're going to be buried at the very bottom. Yeah. So you go on something like YouTube, you develop a audience there because they're totally about exploration, discovery. Yeah. They want you finding new content all the time with the algorithm. So. Yeah, that's interesting with Twitch. So I run a Twitch show weekly now, and my trick is my Twitch show, my podcast, and my YouTube videos are all the same video. Right. Like I just, you know, I take the output from Twitch and I put it into drop me an MP3 that goes up on Podbean for podcast people. Right. And I take the same video, drop it into YouTube, and that goes up to the YouTube video. And, you know, that works pretty well. It's actually not great on YouTube because they're usually an hour long of me rambling and typing. And, you know, no, not a lot of people want to see that, but it gets 300 or 400. Each one gets 300 or 400 views. And if I'm doing something like Rime of the Frost Maiden, I get 600 or 700 views because people want to see stuff from Rime of the Frost Maiden. But they're hour-long videos, and people don't watch hour-long videos on YouTube. They want 5-minute videos. So I do a lot of 5 to 20-minute videos on YouTube as well. But my Twitch audience has built up, right? And I post about it on Twitter, but I don't think that's how people are finding it. And one thing is I'm on at 9 a.m. Eastern on Sundays, right? No one's awake, right? No one. And I had somebody that came into the chat. This is so funny. A guy came into the chat and he's like, you realize how terrible a time this is. And I'm like, well, you're here, right? Like, you know, it can't be that bad. And I'll get 80, 90, 100 people show up for a show, right? And it's not the end all be all. And it's, again, like,
I think of the people that went to my Patreon. I advertise the Patreon a fair bit on the Twitch show, but the number of people that have found me on patrons who found me through Twitch is less than I think all of the others. Maybe Discord was the only other one that's lower. And that should be because you get to my Discord by being a patron. So you wouldn't think they would have found me that way. But yeah, so it's been pretty interesting. But I know like Matt Colville's been pretty down on Twitch. He had a show recently where he talked about the future MCDM, and they were doing the chain, his live play on Twitch. And I think he said like he's just going to go do it on YouTube. So, but I now I've got a system and I like it, and people show up and it's just fun to do. So I still do Twitch. And like the nice thing for me is Twitch then goes straight up to the other platforms, so I get to sort of spread the wealth on, or spread the word.
You have a very streamlined pipeline.
Yeah, and it's not a perfect one, right? Like I don't edit the videos. So especially for the podcast, I feel bad because like they're not even seeing anything. And there's 5-6 second dead air regularly in a podcast. But the numbers aren't going down. It's not like people have, like I'm looking at how many people download episodes, and definitely they like the shorter specific ones. So I do those too, but I do those on Twitch too. Like I'll drop onto Twitch and I'll sit there with everybody hanging out and I'm typing my notes up and I say, okay, I'm going to shoot a video now. And I hit record and I do a rapid video and then I cut and say, okay, the video's done. So it's fun to just hang out with people while I'm doing that stuff. Yeah. And they give me ideas too. Like I'll before, while I'm writing up the notes, I'm like, okay, everybody, did I miss anything? Like, what am I missing that needs to be here? Oh, you forgot about X. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the community engagement aspect must be really rewarding.
It is, yeah. And it took a while, but it was like, I mean, just a couple of years ago, I'd only have 5, 6, 7 people on there. And even that was fine. Like, again, I'm not trying to, I don't want to be the star. Like I'm perfectly happy with what's, with the level of attention I'm getting. And so, yeah.
Well, I mean, you've got me interested, I think, because my main issue with the show is always having to deal with the editing, which is...
Oh, God. Yeah.
Exhausting.
So yeah, last 2 Fridays. So my Fridays are like, I have a couple days a week that are like dedicated to just this stuff, and Fridays are one of them. And the last 2 Fridays I did like, 4 or 5 hours of video editing each day. And I'm like, I took these days off to write, and I'm editing, and like, I am not a video editor. I have no experience in this. I have no training in this, and why am I doing that? And I had a reason. I'm like, well, the good thing is it's temporary. But like an example was I did a live play show with my friend Enrique Bertrand, the newbie DM. And he and I played through a one-on-one version of Dragon of Icespire Peak, the adventure in the D&D Essentials kit. And, we did it because we want to see what's one-on-one D&D like. Answer is awesome, right? We loved it. We want to run Dragon of Icespire Peak because it was new and we wanted to see what that was like. And neither of us had done a live play game before. So we said, let's see what a live play show is like. And so I recorded them and I did the editing. And this is another like Friday mornings we did it. I forget, like 9 to 10:30 or something like that in the morning. And then from like 10:30 to like 1 was me editing them and getting them. So all the ums and ahs and us mucking around with Roll20 and figuring out how come we couldn't get Fog of War to work. All that was cut out. And what we had then were these like 40-minute to 1 hour episodes. And we had 10 of them of him playing, or both of us playing through Dragon of Icespire Peak. And we loved it, right? And they're really fun videos. And people look at them and they're like, they're so, like, you guys are so great together and you're so clean. It's like, yeah, that's editing, right? Like there's a lot of like us umming and ahhing our way through this, but I cut all that, right? So they're like really trim videos. And they're all like, we totally want more of them. And I'm like, I bet you do. You're not getting them. Right? Like that. And Enrique is like, I would love to do more. And I'm like, I would love to do more. I can't sacrifice 6 hours a day, 6 hours a week. So, and then I'm like, and there's other live play streams. Like there's other ones where the production value is so much better. That's a world I'm not getting into. Like I'm perfectly fine. Like I just want to play my own D&D games. Yeah. So, yeah.
I mean, is that where you hire an editor, right? Like,
right. And like they don't make money. So now I'm out, right? Like, those are great videos, but they don't bring in revenue. And they're certainly not going to bring in enough for me to hire a video editor. And then you got to manage the video editor. Like, what's that process like? And what's the timeline like? And they have day jobs and problems at home and everything else too. And like, you're managing that. So it's like, I don't, no,
Yeah.
too
Every
hard.
solution has like its own
its own
problems.
set of complications. Right. So yeah. I just want to make books.
Exactly. Yeah. We just want to do the fun part.
Yeah, right. I just want to do the fun part.
I like the talking. I don't like the work that comes afterwards.
Yeah, I agree.
But that seems like a fantastic point to end on.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, this has been wonderful.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for joining us. This conversation's been super rewarding. Thank you.
And it's edited so well.
I know.
Man, it's so clean this whole time.
It's like we didn't stop talking even like one moment.
Not one moment. Yeah.
Awesome, man. Well, hopefully we can have you back at some point. Maybe get you involved in some group conversations that I've got planned.
Yeah, sure. Let me know.
Thanks again to Mike for joining us. And if you want to check out the Lazy DM series or follow his social media, there are links in the description below. Join us next time when we're talking to the one and only Steve Jackson, legendary designer behind GURPS, Munchkin, Ogre, Melee, and so much more. Of course, last but not least, thank you for making it to the end of the video, and until the next adventure, stay safe.